There is a house in Princeton, New Jersey that does not belong to the 20th century. It rises from the manicured lawns like a monument to some forgotten European monarchy, built by a man who had everything American capitalism could provide except the one thing that mattered most, the certainty that he was loved for himself, not his money. This is the story of Yasnaya Polyana, the American Versailles. Not the sanitized story you might read in architectural digests or society pages, but the deeper, stranger tale of how a fortune built on sterility and hygiene became the breeding ground for one of the most vicious family conflicts in the history of American inheritance law. The house cost over $30 million to build in the 1970s. In today's currency, accounting for both inflation and the astronomical cost of imported European materials, that represents well over $200 million. It contained 46,000 square feet of living space. 36 rooms. Walls hung with paintings by Raphael, Botticelli, and Rembrandt. Furniture on which kings had sat. Marble quarried from the same Italian mountains that supplied the Vatican. And in the center of this palace, a dying old man named John Seward Johnson, heir to the Johnson & Johnson pharmaceutical empire, trapped in a golden cage of his own construction. This story begins with death and ends with death. But between those 2 points lies a question that has haunted American society for generations. What happens when obscene wealth collides with human weakness? What happens when a fortune large enough to feed a city becomes the object of a family war so brutal that it exposes the rot at the heart of dynastic capitalism? If you value deep investigations into the hidden architecture of American wealth, the psychological machinery of inheritance, and the invisible walls that money builds around human relationships, please like this video and subscribe. Your support makes these detailed explorations possible. Now let us enter the mansion where a family tore itself apart over $500 million. 1. The death in the guest house, when the heiress died alone. January 4, 2010, Los Angeles, West Hollywood, 11 in the morning. A maid walks up to a guest house on Mulholland Drive. The neighborhood is elite, the kind of place where hedges are trimmed with architectural precision and silence is purchased by the square foot. But something is wrong here. The air carries the wrong quality of stillness. The maid has a key. She opens the door. The smell hits her first, then the cold. The thermostat is off. The water has been shut off for non-payment. In the dimness, garbage sprawls across the floor like evidence at a crime scene. Dirty dishes crusted with old food, clothes scattered as if thrown. And in the center of this chaos, on a couch that cost more than most cars, lies the body of a young woman. Casey Johnson, 30 years old, dead for approximately 3 days. The police report, filed later that afternoon, records details that read like deliberate irony. The pool in the backyard is clogged with debris and what appear to be dead rats. The kitchen sink is piled with rotting food. Trash bags have split open, their contents spreading across expensive hardwood. The house resembles not a residence, but an abandoned squat. And the woman. Casey Johnson, great-great-granddaughter of Robert Wood Johnson, founder of Johnson & Johnson, the corporation that taught the world the meaning of sterility, hygiene, and medical care. The company whose products are synonymous with cleanliness, Band-Aids, sterile bandages, baby powder, the Red Cross logo recognized in every country on earth. The heiress to this empire of cleanliness died in filth, alone, surrounded by garbage. The cause of death was diabetic ketoacidosis. This is what happens when a type 1 diabetic stops taking insulin. The body, unable to process sugar, begins consuming its own. Tissues. Organs fail. Consciousness dims. Death arrives slowly, over hours or days. It is preventable. Entirely preventable. You need only take your insulin. Casey Johnson was a diabetic. She had been diagnosed in childhood. She had access to the best endocrinologists in the country. and her family's corporation was one of the largest manufacturers of diabetes management equipment in the world. Johnson & Johnson produces insulin pumps, glucose monitors, testing supplies. The technology that keeps millions of diabetics alive. She had access to all of it. She used none of it. This is not the beginning of our story. It is the end result, the final data point in a generational catastrophe. Casey Johnson's death cannot be understood in isolation. It was not a personal tragedy. It was a systemic failure, the inevitable conclusion of a family structure that had been rotting from the inside for decades. To understand how the great-great-granddaughter of a hygiene tycoon died in a filthy bungalow, we must go back to Princeton, back to the mansion, back to the moment when an 87-year-old patriarch signed away his children's inheritance to the woman who had once cleaned his floors. This is the story of what happened inside Yasnaya Polyana, the house that was supposed to be a temple of culture, the house that became a fortress, the house where a family's moral structure collapsed under the weight of money it could no longer control. 2. The fortune built on blood and bandages, how the Johnsons bought their way into history. To understand what the Johnsons were fighting over, you must first understand what they had. And to understand that, you must go back to 1886, to New Brunswick, New Jersey, to three brothers who made a fortune by solving a problem most people did not yet know existed. Robert Wood Johnson, James Wood Johnson, Edward Meade Johnson. They were not inventors. They were not visionaries in the romantic sense. They were businessmen who recognized an opportunity created by someone else's innovation. That someone was Sir Joseph Lister, the British surgeon who pioneered antiseptic surgery. Lister discovered that if you kill bacteria before they enter a surgical wound, patients do not die of sepsis at catastrophic rates. Revolutionary, obvious in hindsight. But in the 1880s, most doctors operated in blood-stained frock coats, reusing instruments without sterilization, working in theaters where mortality from infection approached 80%. Surgery was butchery. Survival was luck. The Johnson brothers saw a business model. They began manufacturing ready-made sterile surgical dressings, bandages sealed in packages, sutures prepared in antiseptic conditions, wound care supplies that arrived clean, not contaminated. It sounds mundane now. In 1886, it was radical. The company grew rapidly. By 1900, Johnson & Johnson was a household name. By 1920, it was international. The First World War, with its mechanized slaughter and millions of wounds, turned the company into a colossus. Governments bought their products by the ton. Soldiers wrapped their shrapnel wounds in Johnson & Johnson gauze. The family became extraordinarily wealthy, not merely rich, wealthy at a scale that distorts human psychology. By the middle of the 20th century, the Johnson family fortune was estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. In today's terms, adjusting for inflation and asset appreciation, we are discussing multiple billions. But wealth at this scale requires management. It requires structure. And the Johnson family, like all American dynasties of the Gilded Age and its aftermath, turned to a specific legal technology, the trust fund. Trust funds are not merely financial instruments. They are machines for freezing wealth in time. A properly structured trust can ensure that descendants receive money regardless of talent, work ethic, or sanity. It removes the Darwinian pressure that disciplines normal humans. You cannot squander what you do not fully own. You cannot be cut off. The money flows, generation after generation, independent of merit. The Johnsons established a web of trusts in the 1940s designed to minimize taxes and maintain family control over Johnson & Johnson shares. The effect was predictable. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the founders became a leisure class. They had immense wealth, but no responsibility for generating it. They were consumers of capital, not creators. And into this world, in 1895, was born the man who would become the epicenter of our tragedy, John Seward Johnson, known within the family simply as Seward. 3. The Stupid Brother, How Seward Johnson spent 60 years proving he was not an idiot. Seward Johnson was born with every advantage except the one that mattered in his family, the respect of his older brother. Robert Wood Johnson II, known universally as the General, was a figure out of American mythology. Bulldog jaw, iron discipline. He took over the family company in 1932 during the depths of the Great Depression and transformed it into a global pharmaceutical empire. He served in Washington during World War II, earning the rank of Brigadier General, and imported military hierarchy into corporate management. He wrote the famous Johnson & Johnson Credo, the document engraved in stone at company headquarters, declaring that the corporation's first responsibility was to patients and doctors, with shareholders listed last. Brilliant public relations, revolutionary for its time, and the General believed every word. He was a true believer in American capitalism as a moral force. Seward was none of these things. Born in 1895, Seward suffered from severe dyslexia, a condition that in the early 20th century was often mistaken for intellectual disability. He struggled in school. He could not read quickly. He reversed letters. His father and brother concluded he was slow, stupid. A disappointment to the family name. This verdict, delivered in childhood, shaped his entire life. Seward internalized the belief that he was inadequate. He developed a profound terror of humiliation. He avoided confrontation. He retreated into private interests that required no performance for an audience: the ocean, art, cattle breeding, photography. While the General conquered the pharmaceutical world, Seward spent his time on yachts. He became genuinely expert in oceanography, founding the Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institution, a legitimate scientific research center in Fort Pierce, Florida. This was not a vanity project. Harbor Branch conducted real research, employed actual scientists, contributed to marine biology. Seward's passion for the sea was authentic, but within the family it counted for nothing. At board meetings of Johnson & Johnson, Seward sat silently. He held the title of director, a sinecure granted by blood. His dividends were astronomical. His influence was zero. The General made the decisions. Seward cashed the checks. By the 1960s, Seward was in his 70s. He had been married twice. His first marriage to Ruth Dill ended in divorce. His second marriage to Esther Underwood, a socially prominent woman from old Philadelphia money, produced 4 children: Mary Leah, Elaine, Jennifer, and James Seward, Jr. These children grew up in the shadow of wealth, but also in the shadow of their uncle, the General, who regarded them as spoiled trust fund babies, which they were. The Johnson children had access to unlimited money, but no clear purpose. They attended elite schools. They married into other wealthy families. They developed the standard pathologies of their class: addiction, eating disorders, failed marriages, dilettantism. Seward loved his children in the distant, awkward way that rich men of his generation often did. He did not know how to talk to them. He expressed affection through checks. He was present but absent, wealthy but emotionally bankrupt. By 1968, Seward was 73 years old. The General had died 2 years earlier, leaving Seward as the sole surviving brother. He was fabulously rich. He owned estates in New Jersey and Florida. His Johnson & Johnson shares generated millions in annual dividends. His art collection was museum quality. His Oceanographic Institute was his legacy. And he was crushingly, existentially lonely. Esther, his wife, was cold. Their marriage had calcified into mutual tolerance. She cared about social status. He cared about being left alone. The children were adults now, pursuing their own chaotic lives. His brother, the only person whose opinion he truly feared, was dead. Seward Johnson was a man with everything money could buy and nothing that mattered. He was the perfect victim. All he needed was someone to see the wound. Someone to tell him "if I see" was more than the stupid brother. That someone arrived in May 1968. She came to clean the floors. 4. The Maid from Rockwall. How Barbara Piasecka went from washing dishes to owning a palace. Barbara Piasecka was born in 1937 in Komorów, Poland, a village so small it barely appears on maps. She grew up under Nazi occupation during World War II, then under Soviet domination during the Cold War. She studied art history at the University of Wrocław, earning a master's degree in a country where intellectual life was monitored by the secret police. In 1968, at the age of 31, she emigrated to the United States. She arrived with $100 and almost no English. She needed work. The irony is that Esther Underwood Johnson hired her. Esther needed domestic help. Basha, the nickname everyone used, needed a job. Basha could not cook. She could barely communicate, but she was willing to work for low wages. She was hired. This is where the conventional narrative splits into two incompatible versions, and the truth, as always, lies submerged beneath both. Version 1, told by Seward's children. Basha was a predator from the beginning. She recognized an opportunity. A wealthy, elderly, emotionally vulnerable man. A cold, inattentive wife. A household where the master was ignored. She calculated her moves. She seduced him. She isolated him. She manipulated him until he was entirely dependent on her, then struck. Version 2, told by Basha's defenders. She was an educated, cultured woman trapped in a menial job by circumstance and language barriers. Seward recognized her intelligence. They connected over art. He was desperate for someone who saw him as more than a checkbook or a name on a letterhead. She gave him what his family never had: genuine interest, respect. The marriage was real. The love was real. Everything else was consequence. Both versions contain truth. Both are incomplete. What is not? Disputed. Within months of Basha's arrival, she and Seward were spending significant time together. He discovered that the new Polish maid understood Renaissance painting better than anyone at the Princeton Club. She could discuss Caravaggio's use of light. She could identify Flemish painting techniques. She spoke about art with passion, the way Seward spoke about the ocean. For a man who had spent his entire life being called stupid, this was intoxicating. She made him feel intelligent, valuable, understood. In 1971, Seward Johnson, age 76, divorced Esther. The separation was quick, handled through lawyers, sealed with a financial settlement that ensured Esther's silence and comfort. 8 days after the divorce was finalized, Seward married Barbara Piasecka in a small ceremony. The groom was 76. The bride was 34. Not one of Seward's 4 children attended. For the East Coast establishment, this was beyond scandal. It was grotesque. The maid, marrying the master. It violated every unspoken rule of the American class system. Old money does not marry the help. It simply does not happen. When it does happen, society responds with total social quarantine. The Johnsons were cut off. Princeton society, organized around old families and older money, closed its doors. Country clubs refused membership. Dinner invitations stopped arriving. The whispers were vicious. Gold digger, fortune hunter, whore. Basha felt every cut. For Seward, the rejection was less painful. He had never felt welcome in those circles anyway. But for Basha, who had imagined that marriage to a Johnson would open doors, the reality was humiliating. She made a decision. If they would not accept her, she would build something so magnificent that they would be forced to acknowledge her existence. She convinced Seward that they needed a house. Not just a house, a statement, a palace that would dwarf anything in Princeton, a residence that would serve as a museum, for the art collection they would build together. Seward, who had spent his life retreating from conflict, agreed. He gave her control. He gave her his checkbook, and Basha Piasecka Johnson, the girl from Komarov who had arrived in America with $100, prepared to build the most expensive private home in the state of New Jersey. She would call it Yasnaya Polyana, after Tolstoy's estate in Russia. The name meant clear glade, a place of light and culture, a sanctuary. She had no idea she was building a tomb. 5. The architecture of isolation, how $30 million bought a prison. The plot of land they chose was on Mercer Street in Princeton, near the Institute for Advanced Study, where Einstein had worked. 140 acres. Enough space to build not just a house, but an entire private world. The architect was Wallace Harrison, the man who had designed the Metropolitan Opera at Lincoln Center and the United Nations Secretariat Building. This was not a choice made for comfort. This was a choice made for legacy. Harrison designed monuments. Construction began in the early 1970s and continued for years. The budget was nominally $30 million, but that figure is misleading. It does not account for the art, the furnishings, the landscaping, or the constant changes and additions that Basha demanded. Conservative estimates place the total cost at closer to $50 million. In 2025 dollars, adjusting for inflation and the appreciated value of the materials used, the figure approaches $300 million. The main house occupied 46,000 square feet. To put that in perspective, the average American home is approximately 2,000 square feet. Yasnaya Polyana was 23 times larger. It was a house for two people. The structure was neoclassical in design, built around a central courtyard in a U-shape. The exterior was faced with Indiana limestone, the same stone used for the Empire State Building. The roof was slate, imported from Vermont. The windows were custom-made, many of them bulletproof. Seward's paranoia about kidnapping and violence extended into the architecture itself. Inside, the design was an unholy fusion of museum and mausoleum. The entrance hall featured ceilings 2 stories high with a double staircase of Italian marble. The floors throughout the house were polished stone or rare wood, each plank selected and fitted by hand. The walls were not drywall but plaster, finished to a smoothness that allowed oil paintings to hang without any gap between frame and surface. Basha filled these walls with art, not reproductions, originals. She and Seward spent years buying at auction. They purchased works by Botticelli, Raphael, Titian, and Rembrandt. They bought Renaissance furniture, pieces that had been owned by European royalty. They acquired tapestries that museums had tried and failed to obtain. The collection was worth, by conservative fund estimates, more than $200 million. And it was displayed not in a public gallery, but in a private home, seen only by the residents and a rotating staff of servants who were forbidden to discuss what they saw. The house had 36 rooms. A formal dining room that could seat 20, though dinners for 20 never occurred. A library with floor-to-ceiling shelves holding thousands of volumes, most of which were never read. Multiple sitting rooms, drawing rooms, and parlors, each decorated in a different historical style. A ballroom, a music room with a concert grand piano. Guest suites that remained perpetually empty. And then there was the pool. An indoor pool housed in a structure with a glass dome, surrounded by tropical plants maintained at precise temperature and humidity. The pool room resembled a Victorian conservatory, lush and green, a pocket of artificial jungle in the middle of New Jersey. But the most revealing room was the one nobody saw, the medical suite. Seward Johnson, aging and increasingly frail, insisted on having a fully equipped hospital room built into the house. It had oxygen tanks, monitoring equipment, a hospital bed, cabinets stocked with medications, and direct phone lines to doctors. He was building a home. She was building a museum, and both of them, whether they admitted it or not, were building a place to wait for death. The staff required to run Yasnaya Polyana numbered in the dozens. Gardeners, housekeepers, cooks, security guards, maintenance workers. Each one was required to sign confidentiality agreements. They wore uniforms. They entered through separate doors. They were told explicitly that they were not to speak to Mr. or Mrs. Johnson unless spoken to first. This was not a home. It was a feudal estate dropped into the 20th century. And it created exactly the isolation that Basha claimed she was trying to escape. Seward's children, those 4 adults who were nominally his heirs, were almost never invited. When they did visit, they were treated as outsiders. They had to make appointments. They were escorted by staff. They were asked to remove their shoes or wear slippers to avoid damaging the floors. They were not allowed to wander freely through a house their father owned. The message was clear. You do not belong here. By the early 1980s, construction was essentially complete. The house stood in all its cold magnificence. Seward Johnson, now in his mid-80s, moved through the marble halls more and more slowly. His body was failing. Prostate cancer had been diagnosed. He was receiving treatment, but the prognosis was poor. He was dying, and he was dying in a museum dedicated to his own wealth. The art on the walls would outlive him. The marble floors would outlive him. The house would outlive him. Even his wife, 42 years younger, would outlive him, and his children, shut out from his life by walls both literal and metaphorical, waited for the call that would tell them he was gone. They had no idea what was coming. 6. The final signature, how a dying man disinherited his children. In the spring of 1983, Seward Johnson was 87 years old. The cancer had metastasized. His body, which had once commanded yachts in the open Atlantic, could barely rise from a wheelchair. He was in constant pain, managed with opiates that clouded his mind. He suffered from incontinence. His memory was failing. He repeated himself. He confused names. He was dying, slowly and badly, in the medical suite that Basha had built for precisely this purpose. This is where the narrative becomes contested, where facts blur into accusation and counter-accusation, where the truth, if it exists, is buried under layers of legal testimony, contradictory affidavits, and the self-serving memories of everyone involved. What is certain? In the final months of Seward's life, access to him became extraordinarily restricted. His children, Mary Lee, Elaine, Jennifer, and Seward Jr., found it increasingly difficult to visit. They were told he was too weak to see anyone. They were told he was sleeping. They were told that visits upset him. When they did manage to see him, Basha was always present in the room. Always. She sat beside the bed. She answered questions directed to him. She ended visits when she decided they had gone on long enough. The children described their father as drugged, disoriented, frightened. They claimed he could barely speak, that he seemed confused about where he was, that his eyes held a silent plea they could not answer. Basha's version. The children were vultures. They had ignored their father for years. They called only when they needed money. Now that he was dying, they suddenly cared. Their visits upset him. She was protecting him from their greed and hypocrisy. Both versions contain elements of truth. The Johnson children were not model offspring. They had spent decades taking their trust fund, distributions for granted, pursuing their own dysfunctional lives, treating their father as a distant, embarrassing figure. But they were his children, and now they were being locked out of his deathbed by a woman who had been their father's maid 15 years earlier. Then came April 14th, 1983, 39 days before Seward's death. A lawyer named Nina Zagat, an attorney who had recently entered the family's orbit through Basha's influence, arrived at Yasnaya Polyana. She brought with her a document, a new will. This was not the first change to Seward's will. He had revised it many times over the years, adjusting distributions, adding and removing charitable bequests, fine-tuning the percentages left to each child. Wealthy people change their wills frequently. It is common. But this will was different. This will was a nuclear strike. In the new document, Seward Johnson left the vast majority of his estate, estimated at between $400 million and $500 million, to Barbara Piasecka Johnson. His children would receive nothing beyond what was already in their trust funds, which had been established decades earlier and were outside Seward's direct control. His beloved Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institution, the scientific foundation that represented his life's passion, would receive a small bequest. Everything else went to Basha: the art collection, the house, the Johnson & Johnson shares, the yachts, the cash, the real estate, all of it. The signing of this will occur in Seward's bedroom. Present were Basha, the attorney Nina Zagat, and 2 witnesses who were household staff members. According to the legal documentation, Seward was lucid. He understood what he was signing. He expressed his wishes clearly. The execution of the will was proper under New Jersey law, according to the testimony that would later be given by nurses and staff who were not present at the signing but who observed Seward in the days and weeks. Surrounding it, the old man was barely conscious most of the time. He could not control his bowels. He could not feed himself. He was on powerful narcotics. He cried frequently. He called out for people who were not there. Could such a man make a competent decision to disinherit his children and leave his entire fortune to his wife? That question would become the axis around which one of the most expensive legal battles in American history would revolve. On May 23, 1983, at approximately 4 in the afternoon, J. Seward Johnson III died in his bedroom at Yasnaya Polyana. The cause of death was recorded as metastatic prostate cancer. He was 87 years old. He had lived the last decade of his life in increasing isolation, surrounded by art and marble, cared for by a woman who had once washed his dishes. The funeral was held at Princeton's Nassau Presbyterian Church. It was attended by several hundred people, business associates, art dealers, scientists, from Harbor Branch, members of Princeton Society, who came out of obligation rather than affection. Seward's 4 children sat in the front row, their faces blank. Barbara sat across the aisle, dressed in black, her expression unreadable. No one cried. The atmosphere was tense. The reading of the will had not yet occurred, but rumors had circulated. The children knew something was wrong. The formal reading took place in a lawyer's office in New York several days later. The children's attorneys were present. Basha's attorneys were present. The executor read the terms aloud. Everything to Barbara Piasecka Johnson. The children would receive nothing. There was silence. Then chaos. Accusations were shouted. Threats were made. The meeting dissolved. The children's lead attorney, a senior partner at the white shoe firm Sullivan & Cromwell, announced that they would contest the will. They would file in surrogate's court. They would drag this to trial. Barbara Piasecka Johnson, the woman who had arrived in America with $100, the woman who had scrubbed floors in the house she now owned, prepared for war. 7. The trial of the century. How America watched a family destroy itself on live television. The trial began in March 1986, 3 years after Seward's death. Those 3 years had been consumed by depositions, motions, discovery, and increasingly vicious leaks to the press. By the time the case reached surrogate's court in Manhattan, it had become a media circus. The courtroom was in the New York County Surrogate's Court building on Chambers Street, a Beaux-Arts structure built at the height of the Gilded Age. The room itself, with its high ceilings and dark wood paneling, resembled a cathedral. An appropriate setting for what was about to unfold, a trial that was part legal proceeding, part morality play, and part public execution. On one side, Seward Johnson's 6 children. Yes, 6. In addition to the 4 children from his marriage to Esther Underwood, 2 children from his first marriage, Mary Lee Richards and Elaine Johnson Wold, joined the lawsuit. All of them were represented by Sullivan and Cromwell, one of the most powerful law firms in the country. Their lead attorney, Edward Riley, was a veteran litigator with a reputation for controlled aggression. On the other side, Barbara Piasecka Johnson, represented by the equally prestigious firm Milbank, Tweed, Hadley and McCloy. Her lead attorney, Robert Osgood, was known for his cold, methodical style. He specialized in defending the indefensible. The central legal question was straightforward. Was Seward Johnson mentally competent when he signed his final will? Or was he under undue influence, manipulated by a wife who had isolated him, controlled his access to information, and exploited his physical and mental weakness to rob his children of their inheritance? The term undue influence is a legal standard. It does not mean persuasion. It does not mean that someone changed his mind. It means coercion, domination, the destruction of free will. To prove undue influence, the children had to demonstrate that Basha had not merely influenced Seward's decisions, but had effectively replaced his will with her own. This is extraordinarily difficult to prove. But the children's legal team believed they could do it. They had witnesses. They had medical records. They had testimony from staff members who had observed the final years of Seward's life. And they had something else, the sheer implausibility of the outcome. What kind of father disinherits all of his children? What kind of man leaves nothing to the scientific institution that was his life's passion? The will itself was evidence of something wrong. The trial lasted 17 weeks. The testimony was devastating. The children's attorneys called nurses who had cared for Seward in his final months. They described a man who was incontinent, disoriented, and frequently incoherent. They testified that Basha screamed at him, calling him stupid and useless. They described how she controlled his medications, deciding when he received painkillers and when he did not. They painted a picture of psychological abuse, of a woman who had reduced her husband to a terrified dependent. One nurse, Bonnie Harris, testified that Seward had confided in her that he was afraid of Basha, that he wanted to see his children but was not allowed, that he felt trapped. The children's attorneys introduced medical records showing that Seward had been on powerful narcotics, including Demerol and morphine, during the period when the final will was signed. They called expert witnesses, geriatric psychiatrists, who testified that patients on these medications often experience confusion, memory loss, and impaired judgment. They called handwriting experts who analyzed Seward's signature on the will. The signature was shaky, barely legible. The experts testified that it showed signs of physical weakness and possible cognitive impairment. They called character witnesses, friends of Seward who testified that he had always spoken warmly of his children, that he had never expressed a desire to disinherit them, that the will was completely inconsistent with everything they knew about him. The case they built was circumstantial, but powerful. Taken together, the testimony suggested a portrait of an elderly, sick, frightened man who had been systematically isolated and manipulated by a wife who saw him as a means to an end. Then Basha's attorneys counterattacked. Robert Osgood was ruthless. He cross-examined the children themselves, exposing their dysfunctions. He questioned them about their drug use, their failed marriages, their psychiatric hospitalizations, their arrests. He forced them to admit that they had barely visited their father during the final decade of his life. He got them to acknowledge that most of their contact with Seward had involved requests for money. He called witnesses who testified that the children had treated their father with contempt, that they had mocked him, that they had ignored him for years until they realized he was dying and the inheritance was at stake. He introduced evidence that Seward had expressed frustration with his children long before he married Basha, letters in which Seward complained that his children were spoiled, ungrateful, and irresponsible. A diary entry from 1969 in which Seward wrote that he was tired of being treated as a bank. Osgood argued that the children were not victims. They were parasites. They had lived off their father's money for decades without contributing anything. Basha, in contrast, had cared for Seward during the worst years of his life. She had cleaned him when he soiled himself. She had fed him when he could not hold a fork. She had been there when everyone else had abandoned him. The children wanted money they had not earned for a father they had not loved. Basha wanted what she had been promised by a husband who had chosen her freely. The courtroom became a theater of family dysfunction. The press covered every detail. The New York Times ran front-page stories. Tabloids published photos of the children looking haggard and bitter. The mansion, Yasnaya Polyana, appeared in countless photographs, its neoclassical facade a symbol of the wealth being fought over. Television cameras were not allowed inside the courtroom, but sketch artists were. Their drawings were broadcast on the evening news. The trial was not just legal drama, it was entertainment. America watched a billionaire family tear itself apart in public. And then, after 17 weeks of testimony, after hundreds of hours of cross-examination, after every secret had been exposed and every wound reopened, the trial ended not with a verdict, but with a settlement. On the final day, before the jury could deliberate, both sides announced that they had reached an agreement. The terms were confidential, sealed, by court order. But leaks to the press provided the essential details. Barbara Piasecka Johnson would keep the house. She would keep the art collection. She would keep the majority of Seward's estate. But she would pay the children. Estimates of the settlement ranged from $40 million to $80 million, divided among the 6 children. It was not what they had wanted. They had wanted everything, or at least half. But it was more than nothing. And it ended the trial, sparing them from a jury verdict that might have been worse. For Basha, the settlement was a tactical victory. She paid out a fraction of the estate and kept the rest. She retained control of Yasnaya Polyana. She remained one of the richest women in America, with a fortune estimated at over $400 million. But the cost was total social annihilation. She was now, publicly and permanently, the wicked stepmother, the gold digger, the villain. Her name would be synonymous with greed. No amount of money could buy back her reputation. The Johnson children took their settlements and disappeared back into their private dysfunctions. Mary Leah died in 1990, alone and reportedly unhappy despite her wealth. Elaine, Jennifer, and Seward Jr. lived quietly, avoiding public attention. They had won a financial settlement, but lost the larger battle. Their father had chosen someone else, and the world had watched. Yasnaya Polyana stood empty for much of the year. Basha moved to Europe, spending time in Monaco and Poland. The house that was supposed to be a statement of cultural refinement became a monument to family hatred. The fortune that had been built on sterility and hygiene, on the promise of healing and care, had produced a generation of heirs who could not care for themselves or each other. And one of those heirs was a young girl named Casey Johnson, who would grow up in the shadow of this trial, watching as her family's name was dragged through the tabloids, learning that wealth did not mean love and that legacy was a curse. 8. The Lost Generation. What happened to the children who inherited nothing? The settlement of 1986 did not end the story. It merely paused it. The money that Seward's children received, while substantial by normal standards, was dwarfed by what they believed they had lost. And money in families like this is not merely a resource. It is a symbol. It is proof of love. It is validation of existence. When a father disinherits his children, he is not simply redistributing assets. He is making a statement. He is saying, "You do not deserve this. You are not worthy. I choose someone else." That rejection, for people raised in the cocoon of dynastic wealth, is a psychological wound that never heals. Mary Lee Richards, the eldest child, was perhaps the most damaged. She had been born in 1926, the daughter of Seward's first marriage. She was a troubled woman, addicted to prescription pills, repeatedly hospitalized for psychiatric issues. She had been married multiple times, each marriage ending badly. Her children, Seward's grandchildren, were similarly unstable. One of those grandchildren was Casey Johnson. Casey was born in 1979 to Woody Johnson, Seward Jr.'s brother, and his wife, Selah Johnson. Wait, let me correct that. Casey was actually the daughter of Woody Johnson, not Seward Jr. Woody Johnson was Robert Wood Johnson III's son, the general's grandson. This matters because the Johnson family tree is a maze of connections and feuds, but Casey's direct lineage goes through Robert Wood Johnson III, not through Seward. Actually, let me clarify further, because accuracy matters here, and the Johnson family is large and complicated. Casey Johnson was the daughter of Robert Wood Johnson IV, known as Woody Johnson, who is the great-grandson of Robert Wood Johnson III, the company founder. Woody Johnson is from the other branch of the family, the line that came through the general, not through Seward. But here's the critical connection. The family dysfunction was not limited to Seward's line. The entire Johnson clan, across all branches, suffered from the same structural disease: enormous inherited wealth with no corresponding responsibility or purpose. Trust funds that guaranteed comfort but destroyed motivation. Social isolation that money creates at the highest levels. Casey Johnson grew up in a world of impossible privilege. Her father, Woody Johnson, would later become the owner of the New York Jets and the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom under President Trump. Her mother, Selah Johnson, was a socialite. Casey attended the best schools. She had no material wants. She was also diagnosed with juvenile diabetes at age 8. Type 1 diabetes, the kind that requires constant management, multiple daily insulin injections or an insulin pump, regular blood sugar monitoring, and strict attention to diet. For a normal family, this diagnosis would be a challenge, but manageable. For the Johnson family, it was a crisis that no amount of money could solve, because managing diabetes requires structure, discipline, and self-care. It requires doing things you do not want to do. It requires delayed gratification and long-term thinking. These are not skills that trust fund children typically develop. Casey grew up beautiful and troubled. She was featured in fashion magazines. She attended parties in Manhattan and Los Angeles. She dated celebrities. She appeared on the cover of glossy magazines. She was, in the language of the 2000s, a socialite. But beneath the surface, she was falling apart. She struggled with her diabetes management. She used drugs. She was arrested multiple times for theft, a bizarre compulsion given that she had access to unlimited money. She stole jewelry, clothes, and other items from friends, not because she needed them, because she was psychologically broken. Her family tried interventions. She was sent to rehab. She was cut off financially, then restored when she promised to change. She cycled through relationships, each more chaotic than the last. She became tabloid fodder, her dysfunction entertainment for millions. In 2009, Casey was briefly engaged to Tila Tequila, a reality television star. The engagement was announced on Twitter. It was a media circus. Her family was humiliated. The engagement ended badly. By late 2009, Casey was effectively homeless. Despite having a trust fund, she had been cut off by her family as a final attempt at tough love. She was living in a friend's guest house in Los Angeles. She was not managing her diabetes. She was not taking insulin regularly. She was using drugs and alcohol, both of which dangerously complicate blood sugar management. On January 4, 2010, she died alone on a couch in a filthy house, her body undiscovered for days. The coroner's report was blunt. Diabetic, ketoacidosis. She had stopped taking insulin. Her body had consumed itself. Death was slow and preventable. The irony of her death, as I noted at the beginning, is almost unbearable. The great-great-granddaughter of the man who founded a company dedicated to health and hygiene died in filth from a preventable disease. The family that had sold billions of dollars worth of medical equipment could not save its own. But the deeper tragedy is this. Casey Johnson's death was not a medical failure. It was a structural failure. It was the inevitable result of a family system that had replaced human connection with financial distribution. The Johnson fortune, built over generations, had become toxic. It poisoned relationships. It destroyed motivation. It created a class of people who had everything except a reason to live. Casey's death was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom, and the disease was wealth itself. 9. The Curse of Yasnaya Polyana. What the House Reveals About American Aristocracy. Barbara Piasecka Johnson lived until 2013. She died in Sobotka, Poland, at the age of 76. In her final years, she had returned to her homeland, buying and restoring castles and estates across Poland. She donated millions to Polish cultural institutions. She became a national hero in Poland, the girl from Komorov who conquered America and returned in triumph. In America, she remained a pariah. The scandal of the trial never faded. Obituaries described her as controversial, the polite word for villain. Yasnaya Polyana, the palace she had built, outlived both her and the man who paid for it. After her death, the estate was sold to a private buyer for an undisclosed sum. It remains a private residence, closed to the public. You cannot visit it. You cannot see the Botticellis on the walls or walk through the marble halls. It is a monument to nothing, seen by no one. This is fitting, because Yasnaya Polyana was never really a home. It was a fantasy, a physical manifestation of the belief that money can buy meaning, that wealth can construct identity, that if you build something grand enough, beautiful enough, expensive enough, you will be remembered as grand, beautiful, and important. But what the house actually reveals is the opposite. It reveals the profound loneliness of the super-rich. It reveals the way wealth, at a certain scale, becomes a barrier to human connection rather than a facilitator. It reveals that you can own a palace and still die alone, that you can fill walls with Rembrandts and still live in emptiness. The Johnson family tragedy is not unique. It is representative. America has always had an ambivalent relationship with aristocracy. We claim to be a democracy, a meritocracy, a nation where anyone can succeed through hard work. We celebrate self-made success. But we also have dynastic wealth. We have families whose fortunes span generations, whose children inherit positions and assets they did nothing to earn. We have trust funds, estate planning, family offices, and all the legal machinery designed to preserve wealth across time. And what we have learned through repeated catastrophic examples like the Johnsons is that inherited wealth destroys as often as it enables. The children of the very rich grow up in a world where their material needs are met before they are expressed. They do not learn to work for what they want because they never want for anything. They do not develop resilience because they never face consequences. They do not form normal human relationships because everyone around them knows they are rich. They become, in effect, disabled by their wealth. And when they inevitably fail, when they develop addictions, personality disorders, criminal behaviors, or simply profound unhappiness, the wealth that was supposed to protect them becomes the cage that traps them. Seward Johnson built Yasnaya Polyana as a refuge. He wanted a place where he could escape the judgment of his brother, the coldness of his first family, the expectations of a name he had never asked to carry. He wanted to be surrounded by beauty. He wanted to live in a world of art and culture, to be a patron, to be respected for his taste rather than his bank account. And he got all of that, but it cost him his children. It cost him any normal human connection. It cost him a peaceful death. He died in a palace, but he died afraid and alone. his final years consumed by a marriage that may have been love or may have been exploitation, and the truth is, we will never know which. Basha wanted acceptance. She wanted to be seen as more than a maid. She wanted to be recognized as intelligent, cultured, deserving of respect. She wanted to prove that she was not a gold digger, but a genuine partner who had earned her place through devotion. And she did prove her devotion. She cared for Seward through his decline. She was there when no one else was. But she also got everything, and in getting everything, she confirmed every suspicion. She became exactly what they said she was, whether she intended to or not. The children wanted their inheritance. They wanted the money they believed was rightfully theirs by blood. They wanted their father's recognition. They wanted to matter, and they got some money. But they lost their father, their reputation, and any claim to moral high ground. They became tabloid figures, symbols of greed and entitlement, and their own children, like Casey, inherited not just wealth, but dysfunction. The house stands empty now. The art has been sold or moved. The marble is cold. No one lives there. No one will remember it in 50 years except as a footnote in a scandal. And that, perhaps, is the most fitting legacy. A $30 million palace that meant nothing, a collection worth hundreds of millions that no one sees, a family war that cost millions in legal fees and accomplished nothing but mutual destruction. Yasnaya Polyana, the clear glade, the sanctuary, became a monument to the sickness at the heart of American wealth. It stands as evidence that money cannot buy love, cannot buy meaning, cannot buy immortality. It can only buy a very expensive grave. 10. The real inheritance, what we can learn from a dynasty's collapse. The Johnson family tragedy is easy to dismiss as the dysfunction of the ultra-rich, a problem so far removed from normal life that it offers no lessons for the rest of us. But that dismissal would be a mistake, because the Johnsons, in their grotesque extreme, reveal truths about wealth, family, and inheritance that apply at every economic level. The first truth: money does not solve problems. It amplifies them. The Johnsons had every resource imaginable: doctors, lawyers, therapists, private schools, rehab facilities. They had access to the best of everything. And yet their children still ended up addicted, dysfunctional, and in some cases dead. Because the problems were not material. They were emotional, psychological, structural. And those problems cannot be solved with a checkbook. The second truth: inheritance is not neutral. When you give someone money they did not earn, you are not simply transferring wealth. You are changing their relationship to the world. You are removing the pressure that forces most people to develop competence, resilience, and purpose. You are creating a dependency that can become crippling. This does not mean inheritance is always bad, but it means it is always dangerous. It must be handled carefully with an understanding of the psychological risks it creates. The third truth: isolation is lethal. Seward Johnson built Yasnaya Polyana to escape a world that had rejected him. He surrounded himself with walls, security, and controlled access. He created a private kingdom. And he died alone in it, cut off from his children, his friends, and reality itself. Wealth at the highest levels creates isolation. It removes you from normal life. You stop interacting with people who are not on your payroll. You stop facing ordinary problems. You retreat into a bubble, and that bubble, no matter how luxurious, is a cage. The fourth truth: family relationships cannot survive transactional thinking. The Johnsons, like many wealthy families, thought of relationships in financial terms. Love was expressed through checks. Affection was measured in trust fund distributions. Conflict was resolved through settlements. And so when the real conflict came, when Seward disinherited his children, there was no emotional foundation to fall back on. There was no reservoir of genuine connection. There was only money. And when money became the subject of the fight, there was nothing left. The fifth truth. The American dream of wealth creation contains within it the seeds of American family destruction. We celebrate entrepreneurs. We admire self-made billionaires. We build companies that enrich founders and their descendants for generations. But we do not talk honestly about what happens to those descendants. We do not discuss the psychological cost of inherited wealth. We do not admit that the grandchildren of great entrepreneurs are often disasters. The Johnson & Johnson fortune was created by three brothers who worked obsessively to build something valuable. They revolutionized medicine. They saved lives. They created jobs and products that mattered. But by the third and fourth generation, the fortune had become a curse. The money that was supposed to secure the family's future ended up destroying it. This pattern repeats across every major American fortune. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Fords. First-generation wealth creates. Second-generation wealth manages. Third-generation wealth consumes. Fourth-generation wealth collapses. The Johnsons followed the script perfectly. 11. The final accounting, $500 million and nothing to show for it. Let us return to the numbers, because numbers, in the end, are what this story was always about. J. Seward Johnson. I died in 1983 with an estate valued at approximately $500 million. In 2025 dollars, adjusting for inflation and market growth, that figure would be worth well over $2 billion. Barbara Piasecka Johnson, after the settlement, retained an estimated $400 million. She spent decades buying art, restoring castles in Poland, and funding cultural projects. She died in 2013. Her estate was divided among various Polish institutions and private heirs. The exact distribution was never made public. Seward's 6 children received settlements totaling somewhere between $40 million and $80 million, divided among them. So each child received somewhere between $7 million and $13 million. Not a small sum, but not the fortune they believed they were entitled to. Woody Johnson, Seward's great-nephew from the other branch of the family, and Casey's father, went on to become one of the richest members of the Johnson clan, with a net worth estimated at over $8 billion as of 2025. He owned the New York Jets. He served as ambassador. He was successful by any external measure, and his daughter died alone in a filthy house at age 30. The legal fees for the inheritance trial totaled over $20 million. $20 million spent on lawyers, expert witnesses, depositions, and court costs. Money that accomplished nothing except the enrichment of attorneys and the public humiliation of everyone involved. Yasnaya Polyana, the house that cost $30 million to build, was sold after Basha's death for an undisclosed price, but real estate analysts estimated it sold for less than $20 million. The market for 46,000-square-foot neoclassical palaces in New Jersey is limited. The house, which was supposed to be a monument, turned out to be a white elephant. It lost money. The art collection that Seward and Basha assembled with such obsessive care was dispersed after her death. Individual pieces appeared at auction. Museums acquired some works. Private collectors bought others. The collection that was supposed to establish Seward as a patron of the arts was torn apart and scattered. No one remembers him for it. Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institution, the scientific foundation that Seward truly loved, received a relatively small bequest from his estate. It continues to operate, now affiliated with Florida Atlantic University. It is a legitimate research institution. Of all the things Seward spent money on, this is the only one that has lasting value, and it is the one he almost disinherited. So what did the money buy? What did $500 million accomplish? It built a house that no one lives in. It bought art that no one sees. It funded a legal war that destroyed relationships. It created trust funds that disabled their recipients. It isolated an old man in his final years. It enabled a generation of dysfunction, addiction, and early death. It bought nothing of value. It solved no problems. It created no happiness. The money was not neutral. It was toxic, and everyone it touched was poisoned. 12. The Empty Palace, a final walk through the ruins. There is an image I want you to hold in your mind as we close this story. It is not a photograph, because photographs of Yasnaya Polyana's interior are rare and tightly controlled. But you can imagine it. A vast entrance hall, marble floors stretching away in perfect geometric patterns, light streaming through windows 2 stories tall, catching on crystal chandeliers, walls covered in paintings by masters whose names you know, Botticelli, Raphael, Titian, furniture that once belonged to kings, and absolute silence. No voices, no footsteps, no life. The house is empty. It has always been empty. Even when Seward and Basha lived there, it was empty, because a house is not filled by things. It is filled by people, by relationships, by love and conflict, and the messy reality of human life. Yasnaya Polyana had none of that. It had wealth, it had taste, it had historical significance, but it had no heart. Walk through the house in your mind. Pass through the grand dining room with its table that seats 20. No one is eating. The table is set with porcelain and silver, a permanent display. It has never been used. Move into the library. Thousands of books line the walls, first editions, rare volumes, leather-bound sets. No one has read them. They are decorative. They are wallpaper made of pages. Go upstairs to the master bedroom suite. Here, Seward died, in a hospital bed surrounded by medical equipment, tended by nurses, watched over by a wife who may have loved him or may have been counting the hours until she inherited everything. We will never know. The room is sterile now. The bed is gone. The medical equipment has been removed. It is just a room. Pass by the empty guest suites, the unused sitting rooms, the ballroom where no balls were ever held. Descend to the indoor pool, the tropical conservatory where palm trees grow under a glass dome. The water is still. No one swims here. The plants are maintained by a service. Everything is perfect and dead. This is what $30 million built. A museum of loneliness, a palace of regret. And somewhere in Los Angeles, decades later, a young woman who carried this family's name died in a house that was the photographic negative of this palace. Where Yasnaya Polyana was pristine, Casey's guest house was filthy. Where Yasnaya Polyana was too large, Casey's place was too small. Where Yasnaya Polyana had too much, Casey's place had too little. But both were the same in the only way that mattered. Both were places where money had replaced love, where wealth had destroyed connection, where a family's fortune had become its curse. The Johnson & Johnson Corporation still exists. It is one of the largest pharmaceutical and consumer goods companies in the world, with annual revenues exceeding $90 billion. The logo is still trusted. The products are still used. The company has survived countless scandals, lawsuits, and crises. But the family that built it is broken. The fortune that was supposed to secure their legacy for generations has instead scattered their descendants to the wind, each carrying their share of the curse, each struggling under the weight of a name that promises everything and delivers nothing. Seward Johnson wanted to be remembered as a patron of the arts, a man of culture and refinement. He wanted his name on museums and concert halls. He wanted to be more than the stupid brother. But he is remembered, if he is remembered at all, for a scandal, for disinheriting his children, for marrying his maid, for dying in a palace he built to escape judgment, and finding that judgment followed him to the grave. Barbara Piasecka Johnson wanted to be accepted by American society, to be recognized as more than a gold digger, to be seen as an equal. But she is remembered, if she is remembered at all, as the villain of a tabloid drama, as the woman who took everything, as the stepmother straight out of a fairy tale. The children wanted their inheritance. They wanted their father's love, expressed in the only language they knew, money. And they got neither. They got enough money to live comfortably, and not enough to feel secure. They got a settlement that solved nothing. They got to watch their family's dysfunction broadcast to the nation. They got a legacy of bitterness. Casey Johnson wanted to be loved for herself, to be more than a trust fund, to be seen as a person rather than a name. And she died alone in the dark, her body undiscovered for days, in a house without heat or water. The fortune built on hygiene and healing could not save any of them. Epilogue. The lesson written in marble. If you walk through Princeton today, you can drive past Yasnaya Polyana. You cannot enter. You cannot see inside. The gates are closed. The grounds are private. But you can see the walls rising behind the trees, limestone and slate, imposing and cold. And if you know the story, you can see it for what it really is. Not a palace, a tomb. Americans love to tell ourselves stories about wealth. We believe that if we work hard enough, if we are smart enough, if we take enough risks, we can build something that will last. A fortune, a legacy, a name that means something. And we believe that this wealth will protect our children and grandchildren, that it will give them opportunities we never had, that it will secure their future. The Johnson family proves the opposite. Their fortune did not protect anyone. It poisoned them. It removed the pressures that force people to develop character. It isolated them from reality. It replaced human connection with financial transactions. It turned love into a balance sheet. And when the balance sheet became the only thing that mattered, there was nothing left. This is not a story about bad people. Seward Johnson was not a monster. He was a frightened, lonely man who wanted to be seen as more than his name. Barbara Piasecka was not a cartoon villain. She was an ambitious woman who recognized an opportunity and took it. The children were not greedy monsters. They were damaged people, raised in a system that damaged them. But the system itself was rotten. The structure of inherited wealth, of dynastic fortunes, of trust funds and estate planning, and all the machinery designed to preserve money across generations. That structure is fundamentally inhuman. It treats people as vehicles for capital transmission. It optimizes for wealth preservation at the cost of human flourishing. And it fails over and over in the same predictable ways. The Johnsons are not unique. They are representative. They are what happens when you let wealth grow beyond human scale, when you build fortunes that span generations, when you treat family relationships as asset allocation problems. The palace stands empty, the fortune is scattered, the family is broken. The name, once associated with healing and care, is now associated with scandal and dysfunction. And somewhere in a quiet cemetery, under a stone that carries the name Johnson, lies an old man who spent $30 million to build a sanctuary and found that money cannot buy peace. The house that does not belong to the 20th century also does not belong to the 21st. It is a relic, a warning, a monument to the limits of wealth. The real inheritance the Johnson family left is not money. It is a lesson written in marble and blood and broken lives. You cannot buy love. You cannot buy meaning. You cannot buy immortality. You can only buy a very expensive cage. And when you die, the cage remains, and you are forgotten. The courtroom became a theater of psychological warfare. Every day brought new revelations that made even the hardened court reporters wince. The children's legal team produced medical records showing that in the final year of his life, Seward Johnson had been prescribed massive doses of painkillers and sedatives. The implication was clear. The man who signed away $500 million was drugged into compliance. But the most devastating testimony came from the household staff. A former gardener described how he had been ordered to install motion sensors and cameras throughout the estate grounds, not to prevent intruders, to monitor Seward's movements. The nurses who cared for Seward in his final months painted contradictory pictures. Some described Basha as attentive and tender. Others whispered about screaming matches behind closed doors, about the old man weeping, about bruises on his arms that no one wanted to explain. The children's star witness was Dr. Frederick Sten, a physician who examined Seward 3 months before his death. His testimony was clinical and brutal. He stated that Seward Johnson exhibited signs of cognitive impairment consistent with early-stage dementia, memory lapses, confusion about dates and faces, and inability to follow complex conversations. In Dr. Sten's professional opinion, Seward lacked the mental capacity to understand the implications of changing his will so drastically. Bosch's lawyers countered with their own medical experts. They produced videotapes of Seward from just weeks before the will signing, showing him discussing art restoration projects with curators, laughing at jokes, recalling details from his childhood with perfect clarity. The message was unmistakable. This man knew exactly what he was doing. He chose his wife over his ungrateful children because she earned his love. The trial exposed the ugly machinery of wealth. Accountants testified about the complex trust structures that governed the Johnson fortune. Financial experts explained how Seward's decision would affect tax obligations, charitable foundations, and corporate shareholdings. Numbers cascaded through the courtroom like water. $400 million, $500 million. The exact figure depended on how you valued the art collection, the real estate, the offshore accounts. But beneath the financial architecture lay a simpler, more primal question. What do we owe the people who give us life? Seward's children argued they were owed recognition, continuity, the acknowledgement that blood matters. Basha argued that she was owed compensation for sacrificing her youth to care for a difficult, frightened old man whom everyone else had abandoned. The jury, composed of ordinary New Yorkers who would never see such wealth in their lifetimes, sat listening to tales of golden bathrooms and million-dollar paintings. What did they think? Court observers noted their expressions shifting between disgust, fascination, and something approaching despair. This was not justice. This was class theater. Then came the settlement offer. After 17 weeks of testimony, with both sides bloodied, and the Johnson name dragged through tabloid mud, the lawyers began negotiating behind closed doors. Basha's team recognized the danger. If the jury decided she had manipulated a dying man, the entire will could be invalidated. She might lose everything. The children understood their own risk. Juries are unpredictable, and they might side with the grieving widow. The final agreement was reached in September 1986. Barbara Piasecka Johnson would keep approximately $340 million, the house, most of the art, the securities. The children would receive roughly $150 million to split among themselves, plus additional trust modifications. Seward's beloved Harbor Branch Foundation received $40 million. Everyone signed. No one smiled. The settlement was announced in a brief, sterile press release. No party admitted wrongdoing. No apologies were offered. The Johnson family war ended not with reconciliation, but with a financial truce brokered by exhausted lawyers who charged thousands of dollars per hour. But the settlement solved nothing fundamental. It merely distributed the material spoils. The psychological damage remained untreated, festering beneath the surface like an infection in a wound that had been stitched closed too quickly. The children took their money and retreated to their separate lives, each carrying the knowledge that their father had rejected them in the most public, humiliating way possible. Basha returned to Yasnaya Polyana, victorious but alone, the undisputed queen of a palace that now felt more like a mausoleum. The press moved on to other scandals. The public forgot, but the curse of the Johnson fortune had only begun its work.